Thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar. My name is Emma Mamo and I am Head of Workplace Wellbeing at Mind, the mental health charity. Mind provides advice and support to empower anyone experiencing a mental health problem. It also campaigns to improve services, raise awareness and promote understanding of mental health. Mind has just launched a major new project called the Blue Light Programme, which is dedicated to helping support the mental health of emergency services personnel across England. So that includes staff and volunteers working within the police service, fire and rescue, search and rescue, and then also within the ambulance service. The programme will focus on raising awareness and tackling stigma within the services. It will also support personnel to build their resilience so they can better manage their mental health at work. We'll also be providing training to managers, team leaders, supervisors, so they're better equipped to support the staff that they oversee with their mental health. And we'll also be providing information and support to all who need it. This webinar and others in this series have been made specifically for emergency services personnel. Joining us to share their experiences and knowledge of working for the police service are Wayne Goodwin, who's an inspector at Kent Police, and also Andrew Rhodes, who is Deputy Chief Constable for Lancashire Constabulary. So in this webinar, we will talk about mental health in the workplace and what are the key factors that can affect our mental health at work, and then how to put in place a comprehensive strategy to support staff to have good mental health at work, and then also how to support people if they are experiencing a problem. And of course, we'll be hearing from Wayne and Andy about their experiences. So what do we mean when we talk about mental health? So we all have it, the same as we have our physical health. It exists on a spectrum and we move along it from good to poor. And it's affected by many things, both in and outside of work. And it can affect anyone from any background at any age. It's indiscriminate. And in terms of our mental well-being and our physical well-being, equally, they're both important to us in order to stay fit and healthy. And they both directly impact upon our ability to achieve and maintain quality of life. At Mind, we know that 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health problem in any given year. So mental health and well-being is of great importance to all of us, not only in understanding and managing our own mental health, but that of others that we will undoubtedly come into contact with. So within the emergency services personnel, that includes, the colleagues that you work with, but also the general public that you serve. Mind is also aware that there are over 220,000 emergency services personnel working across England. And approximately 209,000 work within the police service, which is our largest emergency service. So it's likely that a quarter of these people will experience a mental health problem every year. However, we also appreciate that this can be compounded really by the challenging nature of the profession and the roles that you do. In fact, for the Blue Light Programme, we recently carried out a survey of 3,500 Blue Light personnel, and we found a much higher prevalence of mental health problems. 87% said they had experienced stress, low mood, or poor mental health whilst working for the emergency services. So this does suggest that if you're working in the police service, per se, you are particularly vulnerable to having your mental health affected by your role. And during our Blue Light research, we learned that over 44% of police personnel said they had taken time off due to stress, low mood, or poor mental health. So this is a huge issue in terms of supporting staff to stay in their roles and doing their work. So in terms of the key factors that can affect your mental health while working in the police service, as part of the survey, we asked people to tell us what was putting pressure on them at the moment and impacting negatively on their mental health. And what was identified was, of course, dealing with traumatic incidents or exposure to distressing events. Also, misconduct complaints and being investigated, increased workload, the effects on your physical health, so long shift patterns, difficulties eating while on shift, and so on. So it's all can impact on your physical health and then conversely on your mental health. Organisational changes and lack of communication about what those changes are and what they'll mean for you. And then pressures from management, but also pressures on managers to deal with all this organisational change and supporting staff and so on. And then following on from that, people spoke about unmanageable expectations, some poor working relationships, and instances of bullying, and then this feeling of being undervalued, and I guess that idea of work-life balance, so juggling the kind of demands in and outside of work. And then changes to shift patterns and so on, and role isolation. We were talking earlier about dog handlers and how they, work on their own throughout their shift and the impact that that can kind of have on people. And then police personnel also highlighted financial worries and negative media coverage of the police service as other issues that impact on their well-being. So all of this added together can, of course, have quite a significant impact on someone's mental health. Now, in terms of what Mind recommends to any employer to do this well, to really address and support the mental health of your staff, you need to have an organisational approach that is reflected in all of your policies and practices and management procedures. And we recommend a three-pronged approach to be rolled out across your organisation and at all levels of responsibility. And what this looks like is, first and foremost, you need to be promoting well-being to all of your staff across the service. As I said, we all have mental health, so it's about supporting people to have good mental health at work. And then it's about identifying and then responding to the kind of work-related causes of poor mental health. So you can understand, what might be impacting on people's mental health and what you need to do to address it or minimise it and so on. And then lastly, you need to have the right policies and practices in place to support people who might be experiencing a mental health problem, no matter where they are on the spectrum. Are they experiencing stress related to work issues? Are they experiencing some emotional distress because of a life event or something that they're going through? Or if indeed they're living with a mental health problem and it's just about supporting them to manage that condition while doing their job in the police service. And what I will say is that senior leadership is crucial. This needs to be seen as a priority from the top down. So just talking in more detail about what does promoting well-being look like. What I'm going to talk about now are some general principles that we know support people to have good mental health at work. But I do understand that it's quite hard to adopt some of these approaches and practices when it's quite a challenging operating environment like the police. So it'd be good to get Wayne and Andy's views later on about what is possible and what isn't. And if things aren't possible, what could be suitable alternatives or how to kind of address these issues. So in order to foster a positive and healthy working culture, I think firstly you need to be talking about mental health, put it on the agenda, talk about it regularly. And what we know is quite useful is raising awareness of some of the things that help people to have good mental health. We all grow up knowing what we need to do to be physically healthy, but we don't have that similar kind of education about what we need to do to be mentally healthy. So making people have a greater understanding about some of the things they need to do to have a sense of well-being. And then, as I was saying earlier, senior leadership and strong leadership on this issue is crucial. So being positive and creating an open and clear culture that values the personnel will send a clear message. And I think it's important to support opportunities for time out where possible, even with people working on shifts, and supporting people to work reasonable working hours. I do recognise that if people are working a shift and an hour or two before their shift finishes, they take a call out, they then have to kind of see that through and do all the paperwork and so on. So I know that that can be quite challenging. So again, that's something we can discuss in a moment about how you can still ensure people have well-being and that work-life balance. And then supporting flexible working where at all possible. Obviously people have family responsibilities and life outside of work, so just being able to offer some flexibility, which is also helpful if people are living with a mental health problem. They might need time off for medical appointments and so on. And then the next couple of points are around that idea of employee engagement and people feeling like they have a sense of control at work. So promoting open dialogue and involving personnel and decision making as appropriate, and ensuring good, clear communication and developing trust. I think that communicating effectively with all colleagues is a highly valuable skill and plays a huge part in creating a mentally healthy working environment. And I think it's important to also create the space for people to raise issues if they are experiencing work frustrations or if they're indeed dealing with stuff on the home front. Again, it's not for you to solve all problems, but it's good to understand where people are coming from and so people can raise their hand sooner. And then I think it's important to invest in your personnel, prioritise learning and development and career development for people. And what we find helpful at Mind is also promoting kind of physical and social activities, both in and out of work, to support people to, again, boost their physical health, which in turn does have an impact on their mental health, but also helps kind of create positive working relations. We held an old school sports day every year, which is quite funny. So I think it's just building in some of those things where it's a bit of downtime, but still with your colleagues, so you build that kind of network of support that you can draw on if you are experiencing a problem, that idea of camaraderie and so on. And then I think linked to this is around encouraging effective peer support. So this idea of debriefs, where people, if they've had a challenging incident or a tough shift, where they can talk to colleagues and kind of process what happened, you know, the course of action they took, and, you know, if there's any learning to take from that. And then moving on to the second part of a comprehensive strategy, this idea of you know, routinely taking stock of the mental health of your police service and, you know, everyone within it, you know, how they're getting on is quite crucial in terms of getting a true sense of what's going on across your organisation. So regularly checking in with personnel, whether it's formally and regularly or informally where appropriate, will allow you as a manager or leader to understand what's affecting your personnel at the moment, and also identify what support's in place that's working well so you can build on it. But then, of course, identifying any causes for concern, any areas that need addressing, which can then kind of help you develop an action plan for what you need to improve, which in turn will increase productivity and enhance morale if they kind of see senior leadership taking notice and then putting in place improvement initiatives. So in terms of our top tips for kind of doing this at an individual level, if you're in a kind of supervisory line manager role, I think first and foremost it's around building your confidence on mental health, so you feel comfortable checking in with staff about how they're getting on. So where you're having regular debriefs or supervisions, these can really help contribute to building trust, and also help resolve issues early on. So I think that's quite key before things can escalate and become more of a crisis to deal with. So linked to this is just about being available for your staff and volunteers so they can come to you. And then I think it's really important to treat people as individuals. We all know that people have different working styles, communication styles, so just understanding how best to kind of interact with someone is helpful. So then moving on from that, hopefully this will mean you're more informed and more confident when you are talking to a staff member about their mental health, so you're better able to support them if they are experiencing a problem. And then you can explore any support measures or workplace adjustments you could put in place to support them. In terms of what this can look like for a mental health issue, they generally fall into three broad categories, including changes to how people perform their role, changes to the role itself, and then also provision of extra support. So implementing some simple changes, maybe someone needs to be able to continue doing their role, but obviously we know this can depend on the specific responsibilities and will need to be kind of explored directly with them. But some examples include, you know, changes to shift start and finish times. So for people sometimes around the medication that they take to help manage a mental health problem, people can be drowsy in the morning or drowsy in the afternoon. So having to think about, are there some ways that you could flex to support someone? And then, as I said, you know, supporting breaks or allowing people to take time out, if only for a few minutes, if they're feeling under it slightly. And then giving people some quiet rooms or some space where people can take time out and sit without interruption might be helpful. And then also relaxing absence rules for those with disability-related absence. So if someone's having to take time off for their mental health, and in some ways this might then trigger a review around their absence, looking at how you can relax that, because obviously that could be a stressor for someone. And then maybe agreeing to give someone leave at short notice if they do need to take time off for mental health appointments, such as therapy and counselling. And then potentially exploring some changes to how they conduct their work, either permanently or in the short term, such as reallocation of some tasks or changes to their duties might be helpful, redeployment to a more suitable role, and or then training and support so they can apply for vacancies or opportunities in other teams. And then also line managers can provide extra support through increased supervision or catch-up times with the individual, providing extra training, coaching or mentoring so they feel better supported in their role. And then providing positive and constructive feedback. I think if people are struggling with their mental health, sometimes their self-esteem and their confidence can take a hit. So building in time to reflect on what they've done well to help counter that would be helpful. And as we were talking about earlier, ensuring debriefing sessions take place after difficult incidences can be useful. And then I think routinely reminding personnel of what wellbeing support is available both in and out of work is really useful, so people can have the knowledge when they need it. And then something we introduced at Mind that might be useful is a buddying system. So having identified buddies or support groups or networks, or potentially a safe space in the workplace where people can take time out, kind of access support from a trusted colleague and so on, or just have some time to do some self-management can be helpful. And I think what's important to note is, whatever support measures you put in place, have a time to review them so that you can see how they're working and whether or not you need to tweak something. And ultimately, both providing and taking the time and space to address any mental health concerns or worries early on will go a long way to ensuring a more positive outcome. So then, talking about the support you can offer, I guess the key thing is, how do you know if someone needs support? And I think observing the people in your team, you may notice changes in them. However, it's important to remember that everyone's experience of a mental health problem can be different, and also there may be no outward sign. That's why it's really important to kind of create the right kind of culture so people feel comfortable to raise their hand and so on. However, if you ever do feel any concern about someone's mental health, some potential triggers or indicators could be changes in their behaviour or mood and how they interact with colleagues, changes in their appearance or whether they're looking tired or anxious, if they're experiencing a loss of motivation or a lack of concentration, or if you notice them kind of withdrawing from just kind of social chit-chat or just withdrawing from colleagues, or if you notice any changes in their eating patterns or drinking or increased smoking and so on. Again, that might be an indicator that they're struggling. Also, if you become aware of any life events or changes in their circumstances, so a breakdown in a relationship or a bereavement. And I guess what's interesting to know about the police service is that, officers are out and about a lot, so it actually might be colleagues who become aware or might notice a change rather than their kind of supervisor. So I guess it's important to create the kind of culture where people feel comfortable saying to someone, I'm a bit concerned about a colleague. And then it's about how you respond to that, because obviously you don't want to create this view that people are being monitored and reported on. It's about, being able to offer support as and when it's appropriate. In terms of broaching a conversation around mental health, I think, it's preferable to do this as early on as possible. Don't leave issues to escalate, and just kind of find the time and space to ask colleagues how they're doing. If you're already doing this regularly, asking, checking in with people, it shouldn't feel too alarming to the person. It becomes normal and part of the organisation's culture. So it may be helpful to ask these kind of questions during regular supervisions or debriefs. And then once you've begun the conversation, perhaps try some of the following, trying to identify some positive steps to address any key issues that have been raised, being realistic and acknowledge the issues that are going on. Sometimes actually that's enough, because people just want to voice what's happening for them and then seek support in that way. But then if it is about, trying to make some changes, suggesting some small steps, making them achievable and natural, and then considering some simple but realistic adjustments to someone's role, or perhaps, as I said, offering some extra support. And I think some important things to remember, be positive, focus on what the person can do rather than what they can't, and try and involve them in finding solutions as much as possible. If someone is experiencing a mental health problem, then they can often feel a loss of control. So trying to involve them as much as possible, and they will also, be the most kind of expert in what they need. So I think that's important. And I think it is quite challenging for line managers and supervisors and team leaders, this idea of asking someone if they're okay and then having the confidence when they say, no, I'm not, and talk it through with them. And I will say, you're not meant to be a health professional. I think it's just about saying, well, based on what we know now and the information we have, let's try this out. And in a couple of days or a week, let's review how it's working. And that's all you can do in some situations. So I think it's just feeling comfortable with that, which, hopefully will come with the kind of training your organisation offers, but then also just experience of supporting people. a useful tool that might be possible to roll out across police services, and I wouldn't mind getting Wayne and Andy's view on this in a moment, is a wellness action plan. So this helps people to identify what can support them to have good mental health at work, but then also how to manage if they are experiencing poor mental health. So it comes from the health world. So someone living with a mental health problem would develop this with their health professional, and it would identify what they need to do to maintain good mental health, what are some triggers for poor mental health for them, what are some early warning signs that they might be struggling, and then what's helpful for the health professional to do and what's helpful for the individual to do. So in a workplace context, Mind has kind of trimmed this down because it's quite a comprehensive toolkit that people develop with their health professional, but we've just kind of used those basics to develop a tool that people can use in the workplace, which they developed with their manager. So it's just about kind of identifying, what does this look like for me? What can help me? What's not helpful? And what steps do I need to take? And what steps does my manager need to take? And I think by planning in advance, you kind of give permission for the line manager to kind of broach the conversation because you've already identified some potential signs that you might be struggling, so they can feel comfortable. I mean, for example, at Mind, we have them for everyone, for every member of staff who's got a diagnosed mental health problem, but then we encourage all staff to have one to kind of help them better manage, their health at work, and then also deal with periods of pressure and stress. But it'd be interesting to hear your views on that. Wayne, do you think that's something that could be rolled out across police services, or?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can certainly see the benefit of it, and supervisors using a tool like that during their sort of one-to-one interactions that they have with staff. We have used a similar document within Kent Police through through the disability support group, again, which breaks down into what the individual can do to help themselves, but also what the supervisor can do to assist them to help themselves. I mean, we always give it with the caveat that just because an individual has put something in this is what my supervisor can do to help me, doesn't exactly mean it's gonna happen. But it does give a basis for a conversation to take place to keep the person sort of well and happy and productive within the workplace.
And is that for people living with a mental health problem already, or is it rolled out for other people?
No, I mean, ultimately we've used them for people that have. We have two versions of the document. We have one for those that are in the workplace, but we also have a version which is for someone that might be off on long-term sick, and that doesn't need to be for a mental health issue.
No.
Either it could be that they're returning to work after a diagnosis of cancer and treatment, or a broken leg, or whatever it might be. But again, it's just so the organisation understands what we can do to support that individual to bring them back into the workplace. And just sort of picking up on your points around reasonable adjustments as well under the Equality Act, if I was to ask a group of supervisors what is a reasonable adjustment, then straight away I know that they're going to start talking about hearing aid loops, disabled access and the like. But the point I always try and get across is it can be much simpler than that and doesn't actually need to cost a thing. I mean, certainly when I was going through the bad period in my life at work, a reasonable adjustment for me was my supervisor understanding that if I was staring blankly at my computer screen for 5 minutes, it wasn't because I was being unproductive or lazy. It was because I just needed that time out. So the reasonable adjustment there would be for him to come and speak to me, and we'd take a walk around the block and just talk things through. The cost of the organisation is negligible.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important thing, that just because because the Equality Act says reasonable adjustments need to be put in place, it shouldn't send supervisors into a frenzy of how do I do this, and sort of looking on the internet for advice or reaching for the phone to HR. It can be a lot simpler than that, and certainly isn't rocket science.
No, and I'd agree with that. I mean, I know of someone who I work alongside who has anxiety, and they said to me that one of the things they asked for their manager was that every morning they'd say good morning without fail, because if they didn't, because of the person's anxiety, they'd think, have I done something wrong? Have I annoyed them? Is there something up? Did I do something wrong? And then they'd have to go, no, I'm being irrational, and they'd have to go through this whole negative thinking and then try and counter that negative thinking, that anxiousness, and then say, no, until I know that something's wrong, I'm not going to worry about it. But that took time and effort and their resilience and so on to manage. So for their managers to always make a concerted effort to say good morning was enough to kind of not make that an issue.
Sure.
And that's really simple, but it was very individual to that person, and that's something they agreed in their plan, which I think it can be as simple as that, really.
And it did, and it's all about it's all about a good relationship between a supervisor, manager, and the employee, and it's for the manager to understand what that baseline is for that member of staff, so they can, if they know what the baseline is, they can see if that varies up or down, and then be able to do something about it. And it might just be as simple as, seem a bit down today.
Yeah.
Let's go and have a cup of tea.
But I think what's useful about having set documents or toolkits to work through, it kind of gives the line manager the permission and the comfort to broach things. Because you might think, oh, is it a home issue? But you can say, oh, we've identified if you're exhibiting this or acting in this way, that potentially there might be an issue for us that we need to discuss. So then they can then kind of address it. And
yeah, and indeed, and certainly we use those plans. Of course, clearly it needs to be with the consent of the individual, because they might not want to go through that process. But obviously, the other thing that we wanted to make sure didn't happen was that it was just a form filling, box filling exercise for a supervisor and manager. It needs to be much more than that. And yes, it's a process to go through, but it needs to be done on a voluntary basis on sort of both sides for it to be effective. Because if it's seen as I'm only doing this because I have to, then we might as well not do it at all.
well, it's the same with anything. If it seems tokenistic, you don't want to engage with it, and it can be more harmful than actually even going through the process than not. And I would agree with you. They need to be kind of living documents, because, as I was saying, our mental health fluctuates, and also, we change within our roles, we take on extra responsibilities and so on. So you should kind of review them regularly and say, is this stuff still working? Has anything changed? But that's really interesting to get your views and about how possible it is to introduce that in a police service. Andy, what do you think? Do you think wellness action plans or similar plans could be something that you could introduce within your service?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the thing with the wellness action plan is the key thing that it's affecting there is the awareness of the person. It's a very personal issue, this, as we know. To what underlying problems they may have, what underlying issues they might have, but it's quite a positive way of them putting that down into a plan and starting to build awareness of those things. And I think that is one of the key aspects of the work that we're trying to develop around resilience, is awareness. Your own awareness of those things happening to you is a real priority.
No, that's really good, because it is about the person understanding more about what they need to do to be mentally healthy at work, and then an understanding of what might be a trigger for them to experience poor mental health. But then giving that awareness to their line manager or team leader or supervisor, so they can kind of have a pre-agreed kind of package of support if they are starting to struggle. So you think that's something that could be possible?
Yeah, definitely, because one of the things with a wellness action plan, even the name,
Yeah.
the fact that people are talking about them, it's a positive thing. It's not being brought in as there's a problem with me and I need fixing.
It's not reactive.
It's not reactive. It's something that's preparing yourself for inevitably what is a very stressful job.
Yeah.
You're going to come across things that are very stressful, that sometimes you take home with you and have an effect on you, but being aware of that effect on you, putting things down a wellness action plan is a real bonus.
Thanks, Andy. That's really encouraging to think that is possible as a tool to roll out across the police services. Thank you both. We're now actually going to hear more from Wayne in terms of your experiences working at Kent Police, and then also what you've introduced in the service there. So over to you, Wayne.
So thanks for the introduction there, Emma. My name is Wayne Goodwin. I'm an inspector with Kent Police, and I have depression and OCD, and I've had both of these conditions. I mean, I can sort of track back into my childhood and see that they were ever present. And in the same way Sir Winston Churchill walked around with his black dog, I have 2 black dogs of my own. They walk loyally by my side. I know they'll never leave me, but I accept and indeed am at peace with that now. They are, however, much easier to control than sort of what they used to, and invariably they walk to heel now rather than erratically around me before I sort of started doing something around sort of dealing with them.
Okay.
I've been a police officer for 15 years now, and prior to that I was in the military police for the best part of 4 years. Both of those organisations, in my opinion, were such where to say how you were feeling and that you weren't feeling particularly well mentally was perceived as a sign of weakness. I mean, obviously, clearly we're supposed to be running towards trouble and not away from it. But also, you can't help but take away a little bit of each incident that you go to. So I guess I did what most men in my situation would do. I hid how I was feeling from everyone, and put on what I sort of called my work face every day that I got out the car and went into the building. I'd put my work face on. If people asked me how I was, I'd say, yeah, I'm fine. But inside I'd be in turmoil. Sort of moving forward about 10 years ago, I remember reading a leaflet that Mind had produced on OCD, and my jaw dropped as what I was reading seemed to have been certainly written about me. At that point, I vowed that I'd never admit to having it. I mean, how could I admit to having intrusive thoughts around violence and the like, and be a police officer? See, clearly those two things aren't compatible. So again, I just sort of suppressed it even further. So the fear of the stigma around being open around these matters, and also the fear of losing my job, just drove it all deeper underground. But about 5 years ago, I realised that keeping all of this inside was becoming more and more detrimental to my health, and I felt like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. So after what I can only describe as a nervous breakdown and being found crying by my superintendent, I took those all important steps and did something about it. I started to talk to people. It was trusted friends in sort of that inner circle to begin with. I then spoke to my boss. I then spoke to my GP, more importantly, and from then on I went into sort of our organisation's own sort of welfare services. And it was that sort of put me on sort of the path to be able to talk openly as I am now, and actually create an environment where something can be done about it. Now, Kent Police is a disability support group which provides a support network for staff who may be affected by disability or poor health, and it aims to raise awareness and normalise issues surrounding disability. I started going to the group's meetings and realised that as a group we were doing lots for staff around sort of physical health issues, but I felt that we could do more to support staff who may have poor mental health. So we put together a series of workshops to assist supervisors and managers in supporting their staff. And so amongst these sort of objectives that we had for these workshops were to identify any early warning signs, give them the confidence to deal with issues under the Equality Act, and a reasonable adjustment didn't need to cost thousands or be over technical, that it could be something incredibly simple, but also to give them the tools to start those all important conversations and not to be afraid of the answer when you ask someone how they are. But also to create an environment where talking about mental ill health could occur in the same way that we could talk about, you've broken your arm, how are you getting on with your treatment. We just wanted to sort of try and create an environment and just normalise the situation. And
how was it when you first started?
Yeah, it was. I'm gonna say standing up in front of a group of my peers and saying, "This is me. This is my story," was an incredibly difficult thing to do, and indeed I do still find it an incredibly difficult thing to do. But it was also very, very cathartic. It assisted my mental health insofar as I knew that by talking about my own mental health, we can create conditions where other people can talk about their own poor mental health and give peer support to each other and just make things better for everyone.
And did you find that once you spoke out, you had then other colleagues coming up to you saying, "I've had this experience," or because people can become a bit of a lightning rod once you do it, it then gives
and
for others.
I mean, I'll always describe it as like ripples in the water.
Yes.
As soon as one person starts talking about it, then other people will start talking about it, and people would come up to me and talk about their medication and how it affects them in the same way that we'd talk about the weather or the last job that we'd gone to or anything like that. And again, it's just really good to have that sort of that open environment where people have the confidence to feel that they can
transformative.
Indeed, and that they can discuss such situations without it being detrimental to their career, the fact that they wouldn't be judged, and that they can carry on doing the job that they love in the same way as they've done before. And yeah, so what? You've got a mental health issue. So once we'd done that first series of workshops, I did an internet search on the subject and realised that the Time to Change campaign were trying to do what I had done about sort of reducing the stigma, but was clearly on a much larger scale. They had their anti-stigma pledge, so with Time to Change's support in 2013, Kent Police and Kent Fire and Rescue Service signed the pledge, another series of workshops that we'd put together. And again, this has just gone on to help create that environment where it's okay to talk about the subject, and indeed, it's a subject that could be considered to be one of the last sort of workplace taboos. I mean, clearly we can't change the culture of an organisation overnight, but I have seen the tide start to turn within Kent Police, and as I've mentioned before, there is a willingness to discuss mental health at all
really
levels of
positive.
the organisation now. So the work continues, and the organisation has now set up divisional health and wellbeing forums that seek to support and value staff and improve their mental health and well-being. One of the strands of work from these forums was to set up a peer support network and place a champion within each police station. We really think that the ability to put a member of staff in touch with someone who has lived experience through a peer support network can help reduce their anxieties, as they can see that they're not alone, but they can also see if someone has come through that there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
And things might seem dark now, but you can stay at work, you can be productive, and you can continue to do the job that you're doing. See, clearly the peer support network doesn't replace professional medical advice, but seeks to enhance the support
But
of
it's
their health
experts
and
by
wellbeing.
experience, isn't it?
Indeed it is, yeah. And the network receive training, so they will always signpost towards health service and welfare services anyway. So it's there to as an addition to
It's a helping
welfare
hand to
services,
support
yeah.
someone to kind of access.
The champion role is a volunteer that has been trained and can act as a confidant. As I mentioned, they do not replace line management, but offer an alternative contact and can signpost to the most appropriate support service, either internally or externally. One of your sort of objectives under the Blue Light Programme is to reduce stigma attached to mental ill health. I can say personally I've experienced none from my employer. I'm happy to discuss it. I mentioned it on a promotion application and then at the subsequent interview. It hasn't stopped my career progression, and nor should it.
No.
And ultimately, the thing I was scared about the most, which was being judged, never actually materialised. Before I set out on this journey several years ago, I used to think sort of being strong meant keeping quiet and not letting any chinks in my armour sort of be exposed. With regards to how I was feeling, but now I can expose those sort of gaps in my armour without fear, as I know that mental health problems don't stop me doing the same job in the same way that I've always done it. So clearly some days I have to be stronger than others, but I refuse to be sort of beaten or defined by the condition. And I must say as well, my final thoughts on the subject, I really wish I'd done something about this many years before, because things might not have come to a head.
Yeah.
If I had done that. So if you haven't already spoken to your GP or therapist, then I would just say just go and do that. Talking to a friend is great, but speaking to a professional can be even better, as they can put things in place that are going to assist your recovery. Being at work helped me. It gave me support and structure and helped me get better. I often get asked, how do you speak to someone who has a mental health problem? My reply has always been the same. None of this is rocket science.
No.
Just go up and ask them if they want a cup of tea and how many sugars they want in that cup.
Exactly. I think the thing with mental health, it's similar to bereavement. People don't want to say the wrong thing, so they say nothing, which is the worst thing. And it is just saying, oh, I've heard something's going on. Is there anything I can do to help? Or as you say, just offer someone a cup of tea and just try and open up the kind of conversation.
Indeed, I mean, it really is a simple things. It could be a text message from a friend or just from your line manager saying, hey, how you
Just
doing?
check it in.
If you need to speak, let me know. But I'm not going to pressurise you into doing that.
Yeah, no, that was really useful. Thank you, Wayne. It's really, I think what's really important, as you said, the cultures that exist and the idea of saying I'm not feeling okay and that to be okay and that to be permissible. I think what's really important then is people from within the service kind of sharing their lived experience. So thank you for that. And then also kind of outlining, you know, what you've then put in place to support other colleagues at Kent Police can kind of really help others thinking about what they could maybe introduce. So thank you. We're now going to hear from Andy Rhodes. So as I mentioned before, Andy is Deputy Chief Constable for Lancashire Constabulary. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Emma. I mean, my national role as well, outside of Lancashire Constabulary, is National Police Lead for Wellbeing and Engagement.
Right.
And this year we kick-started a working group with all the staff associations on. We've got support of some leading academics that are helping us around what we're doing. And one of the reasons that I'm really interested in this is on a professional level and a personal level, some of my reflections from my earlier police service, I think are motivating me to do it and certainly motivating the other people that are getting involved. So, you know, when what we don't do with police officers, or a lot of our police staff in fact, is do any sort of work before they come into the service to deliberately find out how resilient they are, you know, what sort of a life experience they've had beforehand. So we don't really prepare people, we just recruit people and you learn this sort of thing on the job. And you know, police work is something that opens your mind up to and your eyes up to a whole aspect of life that you'd never see unless you're in an emergency service. Some of that is great and some of it is not so great. And I think my personal experiences are that coming into the service as a guy who was married with 2 kids, that hit me quite hard. It was quite a colourful experience, I think, as a young man. And what I started to experience was, looking back, although I wasn't aware of it at the time, is that I started to distance myself from people who were close to me because they weren't in my job. They didn't see the things I saw.
So you felt you couldn't talk to them about it?
If you can talk to them about it. Within the job, you had things that I don't think exist as much nowadays. So you had a very strong team. A lot of officers now come on staggered shifts. They're not as part of a tight team as much. We used to have a police bar where everyone used to go after work. That was a form of sort of download, and it was very cathartic. Irreverent humour. All these things we've sort of ruled out over the years, and I think the experiences I had culminated in significant relationship problems. So the professional world that I was operating in made me become a little bit more insular and see the world in a certain way, and the people around me, closest to me, weren't looking at it in that way. And you know, I don't blame them for that. You know, it was my job, my chosen career. I think the physical impact of the psychological effect of this and some of the things that I saw was quite significant. So one of the issues that happened when I was a detective inspector, we were going through a particularly nasty murder where there was 4 post-mortems to do all at the same time. And as I've said before, you know, one of them had an impact on me. The whole experience did. I was a detective inspector. The exhibits officer, who was younger in service, a detective, actually said he didn't want to be there because his wife had had a miscarriage recently, and the post-mortem was a pretty sort of tricky one, to be quite honest, because one of the deceased that we were doing a post-mortem on was actually pregnant. So he didn't want to do that. He raised that, and I should have stepped in, but the detective superintendent told him he had to leave. You know, if you can't do this sort of job, there's no point trying to be a detective. Sort of man up or leave, which he did. And I feel quite ashamed about that now. I should have said something about that for that young officer, because I think this is one of the issues that we're talking about. The culture and the line management around emergency service personnel needs to be really switched on to the sort of issues that we're seeing. And if people come forward, we should treat that positively, not as a negative.
No, I mean, and do you just feel that because at that present time, for maybe a couple of weeks or a month, he was just struggling with cases like that? It wasn't something that was going to continue. It was just because his resilience had been impacted by that personal experience.
Yeah. If he'd have said to the detective superintendent, "Oh, I fractured my wrist playing squash last week, I can't write," and he said, "Oh, okay, get somebody else in." Yeah. But you know, their physical injury, mental health issues. You know, he's obviously feeling very stressed about that, and
it's actually, very triggering.
Yeah, that's right, and it was triggering something. And you know, in my own reflection of that was, obviously I'm caught up in the technical nature as well of what we're doing. You can forget that there's this emotional experience going on for people around you as well. So I think for line managers, that's really important for all of us. To not forget that you know, chaos, crisis is emotional. It's emotional chaos as well. And there's a lot of stuff going on that people carry with them. And one of the positive things line managers can do is just be available to talk to people, or be a little bit more supportive and empathetic than that experience. You know, I certainly felt that when I went home that night, I had a lot going on in my head. My wife at the time was talking about her day. I started to really distance myself from her life because I felt it was trivial. I didn't tell her what I'd done that day, because why would you? You're not going to go home and tell your wife really what you've just done. Stood in a mortuary all day. So I think that's when the work-related stress, mental health issues start to overlap into the personal life and vice versa. Right. And certainly the work that we're doing on the National Working Group is looking at that very issue, at the person as a 24/7 human being. It's not as if you can
switch things off.
No, you can't compartmentalise this stuff. And, you know, a lot of people in emergency services tend to migrate towards each other, you know, because they feel that they understand each other's world.
We were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, it's very common. You know, police officers marry nurses, nurses marry firemen, and what have you, you know, and police officers marry each other. You know, and rates of divorce in emergency services are very, very high. Relationship issues, breakdown, very, very high. When that happened to me, that's another experience again in the police service where something in your personal life is having an impact on you. You're under a lot of stress, as you've just said. We don't seem to be able to think that people are just going to be able to move through this. And people do distance themselves from people who are suffering those sort of things in the workplace. And I certainly suffered from severe sleep deprivation. And that translated into, so my mental health issue translated into a physical health manifestation. And, you know, it resulted in really bad sleep deprivation where eventually when I was being examined, I passed out on the surgeon's carpet, headbutted his phone on the way down. I thought when I was on the floor, this is a wake-up call, because hitherto I hadn't been aware of this happening. I just thought, obviously I'm not sleeping well because I've got a lot on. People at work will have been diving out of corridors to avoid me because, you know, this isn't uncommon, and I don't think people want to broach the subject. So I think, you know, the work that we're doing is focusing in 3 areas: the culture, and it being a supportive, open culture without any stigma. Yeah. Leadership, so line managers being open and empathetic in terms of talking to the staff about what's going on, not dealing with the situation, but signposting them towards services or suggesting, you know, what about a wellness plan? And then the other one is actually personal resilience. So the service is really in need, I think, of understanding pre-join and throughout a career path of somebody who works in emergency services, what is the resilience support we can give to those people? I know that's a lot of the work that you've been doing as well on the Blue Light programme. And my take on that is that self-awareness is one of the most beneficial things that we can bring out in people, because just to spot the signs in yourself means you can spot them in somebody else as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so if I'm aware of what's happening with me, I'm more likely to be aware of what's happening with people I work with. And that is all part and parcel of the culture we're trying to create.
No, that's really useful. Is there anything else you wanted to add on any of what you're doing?
No, I just think that there is a massive movement in the police service.
It does feel that way, doesn't it?
You know, there is definitely something happening, probably because we're going through, you know, a tough time in terms of cuts. I think it's focused in people's minds. Certainly, we've got a really, really strong network of people around the country, experts in the field of occupational health, experts from academia, all want to help the police. I think that's a positive, because they see the type of work that we do as really valuable. And there's nothing better, I don't think, for a lot of people than actually doing something purposeful, like making sure that the great people that work in policing actually can thrive and flourish in the work that they do. And that's I think we've got a big opportunity.
No, I think that's really positive and encouraging. I think that when we talk to employers just in general and they're going through tough times or they're having to do cutbacks, they can feel like, oh, starting a conversation about mental health, I can't do that at the moment because we're actually impacting on people's mental health. But these are the times when actually you have to just have a mature conversation about it, say this is where we're in, this is the situation we're in and what can we do. So that's really encouraging that you feel that this is a point when the police is kind of meeting this issue head on.
And I think probably because that level of change that's going on is flushing a lot of things out that hitherto we haven't spoken that much about. I think younger officers and staff that join now are more willing to talk than my generation. Yeah, and I think they have expectations as well that the workplace will support them. If you're going to ask me to do this type of work, what support am I getting to make me do it really well? And our take on it, and it's born out of a lot of case studies that we've got, is that there is a drip, drip, drip effect here of our staff. And something like a change programme that's done insensitively, so moving my office or my locker, you know, I can cope with all this stuff I see every day, but if that starts to happen, it can just tip people over, and I think that's creating quite a lot of stress, and it's avoidable.
Yes, it is, yeah. That's really useful. So I was just thinking about, what was reflected back to us in the survey, and it was absolutely that around organisational change impacting on people. And I've seen it in Mind. We had a restructure many years ago, but because it was handled badly, now when change is brought in, there's a lot of bad blood. There's a lot of, people have memories, and I think that's something you have to be really, really mindful of in terms of taking staff with you and engaging. So thank you, Andy. That's been really useful, and Wayne. Now we're going to hear from Commander Christine Jones of the Metropolitan Police Service in London.
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Chris Jones. I'm a commander in the Metropolitan Police, but I have the lead for mental health on behalf of the National Police Chiefs Council. And one of my responsibilities has been to look at how we deal with mental health and vulnerability in our communities. But the other responsibility for me is very much to talk to you about our own mental health and how important that is to police officers and to the public, that we understand not only what the impacts of trauma are for them, but also for ourselves. I'm sure that you will have had many experiences that are traumatic. For example, your first sudden death perhaps, the first murder scene that you attended, the first time that you came across a very, very vulnerable victim who had been assaulted and perhaps the subject of a horrible offence. All those things do have an impact, and it's natural and it's normal that you should have some response to that, be that one that you can cope with on a daily basis, or perhaps one that causes you some concern and perhaps means that you don't sleep well at night. And I think far too often we assume that our response is not normal because other people won't be responding in the same way. I think it's really important to remember that whatever your response is to any kind of trauma situation, it is your response and therefore it is normal. But if it worries you and it causes you difficulty, it causes you difficulty with your relationships, sleeping, perhaps your performance at work, relationship with colleagues, then you really need to think about who else you need to turn to for some support about that. And understand that that's normal. There is nothing abnormal about having a mental health issue. It is part of being a human being. I often wonder, if I walked into work and was limping, how many people would ask me what I'd done to my leg? But if I walked into work and I was crying, most people would probably find that really difficult to deal with. And I think that's just because of our attitude towards mental health. For far too long it's been a bit of a hidden problem. But if we're going to be really good at our jobs, if we're going to really understand the vulnerability of other people, if we're going to maintain our empathy, then we absolutely have to maintain our mental well-being. And that means being prepared to signal up and say, actually, I'm not feeling good. And not feeling that there is something wrong with you for being able to do that. And the more normalised we make this, the more part of normal health this will become. And that's where it should be. There has to be a parity between having a broken leg and having a broken mind. But at the moment in this country there is not. Going back to policing though, if you're going to be effective at your job, you need to be able to deal with stress. So don't forget, your colleagues are there to support you. Your line managers have a responsibility to support you. And even as leaders, everybody has a delicacy of mind at some stage. Just know that you can always seek support to help you to get over whatever your issue is, even if it's just the shock of having seen something terrible at work or something personal in your own life. And remember that there are those out there that can help you, your own organisational human resources or counselling, seeking help through your GP and local counselling services there, and of course organisations like Mind, without whom we would be in a very difficult place. And certainly there are many people in this country who have benefited hugely from their work with Mind over the years. And now fortunately we are in the same place in policing with the Blue Light programme. So don't forget, being a human being means having a range of emotions and having a concern for your own mental health as much as you do your physical health.
Now we're going to hear from Martin Underhill, who is the Police and Crime Commissioner for Dorset.
Hi, good morning. I'm Martin Underhill and I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner for Dorset. And before that, I was a police officer for 30 years and I retired for a few years and then came back as a politician. So hopefully most of you watching this video will understand that I do get what you do. And actually I have had experience of mental illness a few years ago. I had an episode, I was off work for a long time. I sought help, I sought counselling, and I came back, and it's okay to say you've been ill and it's okay to come back. And that's the important message for today. The cultures have changed. It's now an okay thing to do to say I used to have mental illness issues, or I still do have. And one thing I learned from my episode was that I thought it was all about home. I thought it was major life events going on at home. There were a few at the time. But actually, when I had the help and counselling and therapy and spoke to people, I realised that I picked up an awful lot of baggage along the way. And whether you're a support staff member or a police officer, there is a lot of baggage out there. You're dealing with other people's crisis every day. And some of that will affect you and will get put in boxes inside your head. So please, please identify that and learn how to deal with that. We all deal with things differently. One thing I learned was that when I had my episode, I saw warning signs with hindsight, which I hadn't seen at the time. And so now, because I know I'm vulnerable to another episode, I always look for those warning signs. And your warning signs will be completely different, but mine were early onset of headaches. Mine was not listening to people. I'll be staring at them and they'd be talking to me and it wasn't coming in, and I wasn't sleeping properly. So, you know, they're the signs for me. If they come, and they do come, I had them last year, I asked for help, I asked for counselling, I asked for therapy, and I take some time off. That's what you can do. Because it is okay to say to your supervisor, I don't feel well. If you break your leg, you go to the accident emergency and have your leg treated. And if your mind needs some help, it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to say, I don't feel well at the moment. And the one thing I would say to you is that all of the organisations in policing, obviously I work in Dorset, we all have special procedures in place in case you don't feel well. Here in Dorset, we would activate the TRIM model that you've probably heard about if it was a trauma-related incident at work. But equally, if it wasn't at work, or even if it wasn't a trauma-related incident, we would have referrals to occupational health, we have counselling, we have rehabilitation services, and we have life experience courses too. So we do try and look after our staff, but you know and I know that the only way we can help you is if you ask for that help. Because sometimes the only person who knows they're in crisis is yourself. Someone said to me the other day, I deal with this issue nationally for PCCs, and someone said to me the other day that the problem with mental illness is it's invisible. If you break your leg, we talked about that earlier, it's pretty obvious you've broken your leg. If you're suffering from mental illness, it's invisible to most people, unless it's you, because you will probably not feel well and not know why. So please don't be scared to ask for help from your GP or from your employer. And please do avail yourself of the services that your force and your employer will offer. It is okay to be mentally ill. We know that 25,000 odd cops in this country at some stage will suffer from mental illness. That's because 1 in 4 people suffer from mental illness sometime in their life. So 25,000 people, you could be one of those people. And it is more than okay to say help. Thanks for listening.
There is a range of support available for anyone wanting to talk to someone about their mental well-being or about any concerns that they may have, about work, relationships, health, money, or any other issue. Speaking to someone in your workplace will be most beneficial if they are aware of mental health and its interaction with work and how best to explore what support could be offered to you. So a large part of what the Blue Light programme is trying to achieve is ensuring that Blue Light services promote a more positive approach to mental health and a more open culture of acceptance and support to ensure you and your colleagues can get the right support at the right time. Outside of work, there are many sources of support available which personnel may find helpful, such as speaking to your GP, which Wayne, of course, found very helpful in supporting him. And then also Mind's Blue Light info line. So this is a telephone helpline which you can call, friends and family can call as well to find out about what support is available in your local area. Details of the info line and other sources of support and information will be given at the end of this webinar, so please look out for that. So we hope that you have found viewing this webinar helpful. We have produced additional webinars in this series, one called Looking After Your Mental Health, which delves a bit deeper into how you can manage your mental health while working in the police service and shares top tips from other personnel about what they do. And then another one which focuses on just general mental health awareness, so talking about some of the more common conditions and the treatment and support available for people living with those conditions. And then also talks a bit about how you can support someone in distress, so be that a colleague or a member of the general public, so very useful to watch. Please also take a few minutes to give us your feedback by completing the short survey that immediately follows this webinar. It's really important to us to get your feedback so we can ensure the programme meets your needs. So Mind has also created resources specifically for the Blue Light services and their personnel that cover these topics in greater detail. These in the form of booklets, and they are available to you and your colleagues, so please share these as they may be of help to someone. Please note the details at the end of this webinar will signpost you to further sources of support and information, including the dedicated blue light infoline that Mind is running. So we are determined to reach as many emergency services personnel as possible, so please do make your colleagues aware of the Blue Light programme and the support and services available within it, and then of course these webinars. So thank you for watching. Thank you, Wayne. Thanks, Andy.